So we're following Paul and his movement throughout Greece, and we're arriving here in Athens. And I really want to talk a little bit about the city that Paul came to and how it thought about itself and what was the history, sort of the cultural vibe in the city. And so I thought today we'd do a little sort of side excursion and come up here. We're standing on a mountain. If you read ancient sources, it'll call it Pentelicon. In modern day, it's Penteli, or if you speak in English, if you speak Greek, it's Penteli with a D instead. But we're on Penteli Mountain, and we're looking out at a place where possibly the single most important battle in history took place. It's debatable, but it's definitely a strong candidate. And so what we're looking out over is Marathon. What happened is that in 490 BC, the Persians landed a fleet of soldiers and sailors right out there. Something like 100,000 total people, probably about 30-something thousand infantry, plus cavalry, plus sailors, plus adjunct people, landed there with the idea of setting up a base and then going around this mountain and attacking Athens. So Athens is the capital, and it has been going back 3,000 years or more, of a region called Attica. Attica is a peninsula that extends down into the Aegean Sea. And this is the north side of that peninsula. Athens sits on the south side of the peninsula. And so the Persians thought it would be easier to force a landing up here and then march around this mountain, Mount Penteli, that we're standing on, and attack the city. So you just have to imagine the setting is that 2,500 years ago, 490 BC, right out there, this huge fleet of ships sails in and drops all the soldiers actually out here on the plain. And that's what sort of sets up the drama that will unfold. So Paul entered Athens sometime around 49 to 50 AD, and the city that Paul walked into was a grand city. It was one of the 2 or 3 top intellectual capitals of the Roman Empire. It had big, beautiful temples on the Acropolis and throughout the city. It was pretty wealthy. They were doing well. It had a big, giant port where shipping could take place at Piraeus, which is sort of attached to Athens. And all of that did not exist 500 years prior, okay? If you go back to about 500 BC, maybe 520, 550, something like that, Athens was really kind of not that big a deal. It was the capital of a region called Attica, which is the peninsula we're standing on now, but really had nothing that history would remember it for. It made it special. What happened just a few years after that, though, around maybe between 450 and 490, was that the people of Athens started an experiment. And what they did was they threw their king out and decided, hey, let's make a democracy. And we don't really know of anybody who tried that up until then. So they said, we're going to vote for stuff. And so that was a big deal, never been done before. And then just a few years after that happened, maybe 20, 30 years after, the Persians showed up. The Persians asked for soil and water. So you had to give them a piece of the dirt from your land and a piece of water from your land. That was basically telling the Persians, you're in charge of us. And then, you know, you pay a little bit of taxes and we won't conquer you, and you can be a part of our empire and get those benefits. And a lot of people thought, well, that's probably the best you're going to do because you can't beat them. They can bring hundreds of thousands of troops to a battle. You've got a few thousand men. This is over. But the Athenians had just achieved a real sense of freedom. And they were like, no, we're not going to give up our freedom. We're just not going to do it. And they said, no. The Spartans famously also said no and killed the ambassador that went and asked him, you know, if he would be 300, and 300, they'd kick him down a well, you know. But he was killed there, the ambassador that came and asked for Sparta's surrender. And so then the Persians said, well, fine, we're going to invade Greece. And so in 490 BC, ships came right across through here. Enough ships to carry about 100,000 men. They landed on the beaches back behind me. Something like 25 to 30,000 infantry, plus cavalry, plus, you know, adjacent servers, plus the sailors they were controlling, 100,000 men total landed here. And you see the mountain behind me. We shot up on top of it earlier. They were going to march around that mountain and then on to Athens. The Athenians only had 10,000 soldiers, and they really just had no chance of winning. But what they decided was to gamble everything. And instead of waiting behind the walls of Athens and letting all of Attica get destroyed and wrecked by this invading army, they decided to come here about 25, 26 miles from the city. This is Marathon after all. And to try to fight here. Why would they fight here? Why would they come out from behind their walls when they could have a defensive advantage? Well, what they decided was this. The Athenians decided, we're better at one thing. The one thing we're better at is infantry. If our men can fight their men, we can win. And so what they decided was that if they could get here on that narrow stretch of land between the mountain and the sea, that their 10,000 men could line up and fill that gap, and that the Persian cavalry would be negated. They couldn't get their horses behind them. So what the Athenians gambled everything on was they rushed all their soldiers. They completely depleted their defenses in Athens, took everyone out, ran 10,000 men up here, and they caught the Persians on that narrow piece of land between the mountain and the sea. The Persians never thought the Greeks would leave their defenses and thought they would land here, march around the mountain. Just on the other side of the mountain is a wide open plain. If the Persians had gotten there, then they could engage their cavalry and their archers and all the other stuff that they had. But here they couldn't. So the Athenians gambled on that. They ran up here, and as the Persians were landing their stuff overnight, the Athenians crept around the mountain. And when the Persians woke up the next morning, there was this force to meet them. The Persians spent most of the day trying to decide what to do. Should we attack them? Should we not attack them? They would kind of, feint towards them to see if the Athenians would run, and they wouldn't. And finally, the Persians decided, we won't fight them at all. Let's just get on our boats, sail around to the other side, and land over there. And, let's not fight in a place that's to our disadvantage. But the Persians made a big mistake, which is they loaded their cavalry first. So they started putting all their horses on the ships. And about the time that process was finished, the Athenians, who had just been barring the exit to the beach, charged. And no Persian ever thought, this little scrappy army would attack them. But they did. The Athenians charged the Persian, and you had a major infantry confrontation, engagement right back here on the beach. And what happened was the Athenians had perfected a thing called a phalanx. And the way Greeks fought at that time was they were heavily armored. They had thick bronze helmets, breastplates, kind of like shin guards, greaves. They had the leather sort of studded skirts, and they had a big, thick shield that they carried, and they fought in a shield wall. They locked their shields together so that what was advancing towards you was a solid wall of wood with spears coming over the top of it. And so each soldier had a spear and a shield, and the soldiers behind the front line would also be reaching over with their shields. And so it was this wall of metal coming at you, basically. And the Persians were light infantry fighters. They liked to kind of run around and maneuver. But on that small piece of land back there, there was no space to maneuver. A lot of the Persians, their shields were made out of wicker. They weren't even wood or metal of any sort. They were very light. They were lightly armed because, again, they fought more based on mobility, but they couldn't maneuver back there. And so the Greeks charged them, and they utterly routed them. 10,000 men, these are the numbers. 10,000 men engaged and completely crushed, routed something like 30,000. And the 10,000, the Greeks, only lost 192 men. Like, it's shocking. They had almost no casualties because they were just so much better at that kind of fight. If they could make it that kind of fight, they could win. The other kind of fight, they lose. But that kind of just a head-on infantry attack, they would win. And so they won here. And that's when something really famous happened. Because the rest of the Persian fleet and the troops that got off the shore were going to try to sail around and attack Athens while the army was up here. So that Persian fleet leaves. They're sailing around. And the Greeks, the Athenians, send a messenger from this place, which is called Marathon, which just happens to be, about 26 miles from Athens. And the guy ran, as the story goes. He runs all the way to Athens as fast as he can go, gets there, screams out the word Nike, which means victory in Greek, and then collapsed dead. And from that, we get the modern marathon, where people run the same distance. As a matter of fact, in November, the marathon, they still run it every single year from this place all the way to downtown, will be run from right here in this spot. Actually, my wife's going to run it this year. So that's still a thing. But then that army, those 10,000 heavily armed men, had to force march as fast as they could back to Athens, and they barely got there in time to defend the city from the rest of the soldiers that, the Persians, they came at that point. But that battle was incredibly important historically. It was the first time the Persians had lost. So that's a big deal. More importantly, it was one Greek city-state standing alone against the mighty Persians, sending them, and that ended that invasion. The Persians came back later with the 300,000 troops, and if you've seen the stuff about Thermopylae or Salamis, or you've seen the movie 300 or something like that, that invasion came a few years later when they came out. They're like, oh yeah, you beat a small Persian army, here comes the main Persian army. But what inspired all the other Greeks to stand and fight was the fact that Athens stood by itself and fought and won here. And so they're like, well, if one can stand against that many, if we all get together, we can maybe win, which they did. And that's incredibly important. It's important because of this. If the Persians defeat the Greeks here in 490 BC, then everything you know about Western culture never would have happened. Because the flowering of Athens that produced Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, that produced all the big pretty buildings that you still see standing on the Acropolis today, all of that, the golden era when their navy sailed the seas and traded all over the Mediterranean and became very rich, all of that comes after this and because of this. So if this doesn't happen, there's no Western culture, all those guys and all the Greek thought you've ever heard of, it never happens. So it's really important history, maybe the most important battle ever. But it's also important to the biblical story because it set Athens up to become a very proud city with that intellectual and historical pedigree. And so when Paul came here, that's kind of who they were. And frankly, Paul doesn't get as much traction here as he got in places like Corinth and Thessalonica, because the Athenians were kind of proud and really impressed with themselves, at that point in history. But rightfully so. It was, it's a pretty awesome thing they accomplished here. So I wanted to bring y'all up here. I know it's not tightly biblical, sort of this lesson and sort of a side thing historically. But if you want to understand Greece and how they thought, and if you want to understand Athens and what it became, you have to start with the most important battle they ever won, when little tiny democracy Athens stood against the big giant Persian Empire all by itself and won because they were smart, just right back here. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, click like and subscribe. It really helps us. And if you really enjoyed it, go on over to our website, thelandofthebible.com, and become a supporter. It helps us generate more content and gives you access to our full library of video and Bible study content.